Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another of GGNA's webinar series designed to help our clients and others to respond to these challenging times. My name is Pete Lasher. I'm a Senior Vice President at GGNA and the leader of the firm's higher education practice. And I am pleased to be joined today by Chris Davitt, the Senior Vice Chancellor for Philanthropic and Alumni Engagement at the University of Pittsburgh. Chris's career in fundraising spans more than 25 years. Prior to joining Pitt, she served as the Associate Vice President for Development for undergraduate programs at the University of Pennsylvania, and prior to that, the Vice President for Development at Brown University. At both those institutions, she held leadership roles in multi-billion-dollar fundraising campaigns. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
As I said, you've held senior positions at a diverse set of premier public and private universities. Can you describe your career arc and share what lessons you've learned along the way?
Sure. I love how you say career arc as though any of it was planned. But I think, like most people, I sort of fell into this, right? I had a different job out of college and then realized that I had business skills, but I wanted to apply them to the nonprofit setting. And that's when I learned about development. And I lucked into a position at a small human service nonprofit with just a wonderful mentor and leader who taught me a lot. And that led to a series of jobs at human service nonprofits. But then eventually I did move into education, moved back to Rhode Island, my home state, worked for a girls' school, and then worked at my alma mater. So I sort of became a jack of all trades. And it's interesting, as lessons learned, I remember the campaign consultant at Lincoln School where I worked, he said that this was an anecdotally rich career choice. And I thought that was like the best quote I ever heard, because like it's people, right? You're dealing with so many people, and the ability to be flexible and really listen to the story the donor tells you also helps you as you work with your colleagues or people across your institution or your bosses or your volunteers. And I think sort of my main takeaways were, one, it's just like it always pays to communicate. Like, be that person who is out first with information, be honest, you build up that credibility. I think in our job, I can't remember there's a chef that I quote, but sort of our job is like the success of a lot of things being done extremely well, tiny things all the way across the board. And I think communication's a big piece of that. And, I think the only other advice I ever can give is that, or the lesson I learned is that I think I've gotten ahead by doing whatever I was doing really, really well, or at least trying to, right? So I would love to tell you I was very intentional about, well, if I do this, I'll get this. And I was just way too scattered to be able to do that. But I do think I just tried to do my job well and learn what I could and find people who I could learn from. And that seems to have worked. But again, like people, I will never not be surprised by people. And so I think if you know that going into this field, you're in good shape.
Chris, you said something interesting. You referenced mentors earlier, but you said you would seek out those people. What would you look for in a mentor? If I can.
Yeah, I mean, I again, to oversimplify it, I just liked being around people who I thought were really, really smart. So if I was in a meeting and I heard somebody say something interesting, or as I said, this first fundraising boss I had, I don't know that I was super deliberate about, let me have a mentorship meeting, but I did really try to listen to not only what they said, but how they conducted themselves, how they make decisions, how they sort of clarified things. So often it was a colleague, but I've been very fortunate in my life to have several supervisors who I just thought were so smart, right? And nice, right? So, which doesn't always happen. But I really tried to find those people who just seem to have a real handle on how to operate, particularly in a complex organization.
Yeah. The unfortunate truth is that in a profession where 70% of fundraisers are women, only 20% currently serve as vice presidents. I wonder if you'd share your perspective on this fact, and is there any advice you'd offer to women listening who aspire to be vice president?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Pete. I mean, to some extent, I think there's so much advice out there for women like lean in, lean out. Like I almost sort of want to give advice to everybody else, right? Like, and I kind of joke, but I feel like in the workplace, as a woman, I want two things, right? I want pockets in all of my clothes, and I want to be able to finish a sentence in a meeting. Like, and seriously, if I had $1 for every time I got cut off in a meeting, even now, I would be one of my prospects. And I can remember reading, this is probably 5 years ago, but there was some study about the Supreme Court justices, and the female Supreme Court justices were interrupted more than the male Supreme Court justices. And not just by the male justices, they were interrupted more by the attorneys, right? So if Ruth Bader Ginsburg can't manage, like what hope is there for me? And I really think of that when I'm in group settings. There are people, when I've convened a meeting, who have never questioned whether their opinion is welcome in a group setting. Like they just sort of feel like, of course, somebody's going to want to hear what I have to say. And there are many other people, and I think it's women, it's people of color, it's people LGBTQ, it's people who are just any sort of marginalized or underrepresented community who don't always come assuming that they have access to that on-ramp. So I think if you are a leader, it really starts with how you conduct group sessions and how you make sure that all the voices are valued, and how I mean, I hate to use the phrase circle back, but if somebody steps on somebody else's comment, I think I have a responsibility to say, you know what, thank you so much, but I just want to get back to what Jane was saying because she didn't get to finish her thought. And so I think that sets a tone, right? It sets a tone for how we create a sense of belonging. And I don't mean to sound so altruistic. It's just like a better way to get good ideas, right? Sometimes the quietest voice has the most creative voice. So I kind of go back to that. I do think women can find mentors, and I think women can raise their hands more and certainly back each other up. But I think we all as leaders, we can create settings, starting again with group meetings, that just kind of changes the tone. And for all the women on this call, I was totally serious about the pockets. I'm not kidding you. That would be really great. And the guys don't realize how often we miss pockets. So.
These kinds of insights, Chris.
This is not what you were hoping for when you asked me to do
No,
this.
please. This is super valuable what you're sharing. Let's turn our attention to Pitt.
Yeah.
So, could you describe the state of play? How long have you been there now?
It'll be 4 years in November.
4 years. So you've figured the place out in full.
Absolutely, I have it forwards and backwards.
So can you describe the state of play of the advancement program when you arrived at the university?
Yeah, sure. It's sort of one of those kind of good bones situations from HGTV. I mean, Pitt is an incredible place overall. The graduate programs, the research programs are exceptional. I think there's still a great college feel. Undergraduates have a wonderful experience. We're a city college. We're right in the middle of Pittsburgh, which is a wonderful, completely manageable and livable city for our students and our faculty and our staff. We're an ACC competitor, right? So if you want a big athletic experience. So there's all those things. And I think at the time, the advancement program reflected all of that and had just finished, a couple of years before, a $2 billion campaign, which was beyond what I think many people had expected we'd be able to do. Jana's can't believe I've been here for 4 years. It's like dog years, Jana. But I think at the time, because so much was going well, that attention to some serious investments just hadn't happened. So when I look back at sort of what we do or what we have done, if you look at the whole donor cycle from identification all the way through stewardship and soliciting again, we've had to make investments in people and candidly in process all along the way to sort of create a complex advancement program that is commensurate with the complex and exceptional university we have. So I sort of joke that we're building a supercar, and you have to spend an extraordinary amount of time on the engine, which is not at all fascinating to anybody outside of our business. The excitement that I think our group felt when we finished the prospect assignment and management protocol, like we were giddy. I cannot say that I was able to translate that well to my board committee, but that kind of stuff really mattered. So we took what were really good bones but had to really create a more complex infrastructure and build out the resources to really make us more successful.
Were there certain parts of that cycle that you felt were more critical, or at least in terms of sequencing, that had to be done first in order for the others to?
Yeah, I have become more of a process person than I ever thought I was, because, process can be bureaucratic, but it also actually gives people like structure so they can perform. So what I was trying to do was bring a lot of functions together, but you can't really do that if you don't help people see some sort of ground rules. So prospect management, we had two different kinds of prospect capacity ratings, whether it was health sciences or not. So you had some organizations or some donors that had 2 wealth ratings. And so my very not helpful sarcasm would say, well, that's like having no wealth ratings. So, which is, I'm sure, super supportive to my folks. But, I became actually really focused on process, how we were working with our chancellor, how we were working with the senior vice chancellor of health sciences, how we were supporting our board committee. So more than that, that did have to come first, more than I expected.
Okay. So you made an allusion or you alluded to some of the challenges when you use the ratings between medicine and so let's talk about that, because one of the things that you were asked to do right from the beginning was to integrate the fundraising programs at the university and medicine. So how did you approach that undertaking, and what obstacles did you need to overcome?
I really tried to sort of step back and look at what the donor and the alumni and the grateful patient engagement looked like, sort of what was that journey, and then kind of back it out from there. So, a lot of our donors skewed older, for example, and we were exceedingly successful with foundations, which is wonderful, but not so much on the individuals. And we sort of had very set prototypes for kinds of events, particularly around football games, but maybe weren't as engaging in other areas. So I tried to sort of get a handle on what that interface was like, to then figure out where the Venn diagrams were. If you are a donor, many of our top donors give across the health sciences, to athletics, to their school, to our community engagement, so we sort of had them all separated. And so figuring out how they needed to come together, and then how we needed to kind of create supports and staff underneath them, was my first step. I did tend to look at the org charts. I looked a lot at the boxes and where were we on boxes duplicating. But I also really looked at people, right? So, I years ago in grad school was told you never create a job for a person, and I've decided that's nonsense. I had some people with incredible talent who weren't in the right jobs, or needed new opportunities. And if they weren't here, I might not do it the same way. So that was a little bit of a hodgepodge. And I think lastly, getting back to what I said earlier, like I was coming into an organization that had been through a lot of change, certainly some morale issues, despite people, I think, being incredibly positive and hardworking. And so I focused a lot on communicating, and I probably focused a lot more on what were the incremental changes I could make, rather than coming in and like throwing a grenade and blowing everything up, and how to manage that along the way, because every change creates uncertainty and creates anxiety. And so I wasn't going to be able to solve all the anxiety, but if I kind of talked about, this is why we're doing it, these are the objectives, here's what I need to hear from you, what do you think? I just kind of wanted to manage through change a little bit. So I think some of that sounds squishy, Pete, but that actually it was all kind of squishy.
No, I think change needs to be, I think, squishy, or at least certainly flexible.
Right.
So then you're 2 years, and then the pandemic hits.
Yeah, that was awesome.
So how did that change? I mean, how did that change your plans?
Well, I'm fortunate that we were at the point in the reorg we were, because what we had been able to do, obviously my job is to engage more alumni, raise more money. And we were on that trajectory, but I've I'm trying to build something that's sustainable. And so a lot of other metrics we were looking at had to do with both quality and quantity, right? So how many donors did we have? Was our donor number going up or down? How many major gift donors did we have? How many $10 million plus donors did we have? What was our total sort of volume of activity? And the good news is that we had really course corrected on a lot of those things. So even with the pandemic, 2020, the last quarter of 20 to June 30, 2020 was pretty abysmal for us. But we really bounced back very well in 2021. And a lot of it is because those core metrics stayed on track. So we were closing large gifts, and we were finding the great momentum. I think because we had also strengthened our advancement services, our communications, our donor relations, our events team, we were able to, on top of alumni relations, we were able to pivot a lot of that digital, right? So, certainly all of our gift processing kept working and our stewardship and things like that, but we were able to figure out how to do what everybody else had to do, is how do you engage with people? But I had those resources in place. And so I felt pretty good about that. And we see that still, we see a lot of that still building. But yeah, I mean, ideally I had a really lovely trajectory that had us continuing up, and that, put a little bit of a wrinkle in the plans.
Well, and dollars are certainly the key
Right.
metric for us. But I wonder if you could just build a little bit more and talk about how you've approached building a high-performing advancement program.
Yeah, so as I said, we had some staff turnover before I got here and some morale issues. So I really focused a lot on people at the beginning. And it's not like I'm not like a kindergarten teacher, right? They're all highly professional people. So it wasn't just sort of like song circles, but it was just trying to be engaging and accessible, and really hear what people thought, what our opportunities were and both our challenges. And that was also a process to set expectations. I think by my second year, I started using the phrase that we were going to do more and better and faster, right? And just kind of continuing to talk about pace and expectations. We had some pretty concerning statistics about, if somebody's capacity is 100,000, on average, we were going out with an ask at this percent of that, and you put some numbers like that and you realize that people can understand that we were under asking and under closing. So I really kind of focused on that. And then it was identifying 4 core objectives, which kind of become everything we do needed to tie those objectives, and they're not rocket science. It relates to, building a culture of philanthropy and raising our donor numbers and creating better alumni engagement and building our capacity. But by creating that framework, everything we did, I would say, and this is what it points to, and this is how it's going to support these objectives. And so I think trying to be as consistent as possible. Listen, we had to do some really basic things though. We were underpaying. We still are, right? So we had to get some resources and make sure we were making the right investments, so that we could be much more market competitive. And then I think on top of that, we've just kind of been clear on metrics, and we're not hard and fast. I sometimes things don't fall, but people are really trying hard. But we're really clear on what we measure and how we measure it from, again, the very beginning. I've closed gifts that happened because the person who answered the phone did the exact right thing. So you have to value that whole process. So again, it's a lot of small things kind of pulled together.
I heard a vice president say yesterday, we're not asking for enough, and we're not asking enough, and we're not asking for enough.
Yeah. I mean, every once in a while I can, wake up in the middle of the night and go like, oh my God, do we have enough prospects if I wanted to do this? But that's like beyond my control. Like what I do know is we have, 300,000 plus alumni who love the university. We've got grateful patients. We've got great support in the city and beyond. Like I'll worry about not having enough donors after I've figured out how to work with all of them. I don't have to borrow trouble at this point.
So let's talk about working with donors and also working with some other stakeholders. So
yeah.
How have you engaged institutional and academic leadership in the fundraising process?
Yeah. I'm gonna give you a sentence, Pete, I've never really always been able to say before. I absolutely love my advancement committee. Like I have great board support. And I'm being completely sincere. It's a hard sentence for me to finish because I think volunteers can be our biggest challenge. But I have a wonderful board chair, and she's supportive and thoughtful and proactive. And since, with my making a lot of change, I had to bring a lot of people along, and they were the first to jump on board, and I think that's great. And I think overall the leadership is enthusiastic about fundraising, but we've needed to define that involvement and, candidly educate, right? So this idea of the dean, the provost, the chancellor is going to come in and just like close the big gift and then head home, like that's just not the model, right? And especially when it comes to the more complex gifts where you've got multiple touches along the way to bring a relationship along. So I would say that we've made some real strides. We've instituted goals for the deans and their involvement in fundraising that's based on dollars. When I got here, a number of them were concerned about the number of visits they were making and their alumni giving participation. And I was like, I don't want you to worry about that. Like, you need to be making the right visits, and we've got a whole machinery that's taking care of the participation, and you feed into that. But so I think that's been helpful, and our provost has been really supportive of that. Our chancellor is very active in fundraising. I think we face the same challenge everybody else does. He's a busy man, and trying to, especially as we look ahead, trying to get enough time on his calendar. He is warm and affable, and he's also super, super smart. And so people really respond well to him. So we just keep demanding more time from him. One of the things I did was hire somebody to run our principal gift and chancellor outreach program. She happens to be a Pitt alumna, so it's like perfect all around. And she works with him every week and with his chief of staff. So we have that access. She's able to kind of keep him on track, and we've seen the uptick in his activity. And also she's able to report back and sort of tie things together. So he realizes that, yes, it was a phone call, or yes, it was this, but here's how it's advancing the strategy. And so I think, I think closing the loops there. And I think the other thing is we've created 2 positions, one with our chancellor's office and one with the senior vice chancellor for health sciences, who's also very active, just simply to operationalize their offices. So from their office's perspective, their interface with us is through one person on all the operation stuff. We make it very, we reduce the friction points. So that has worked, just so that they find working with us not difficult.
It goes back to your point about communication, and can we keep those channels of communications open?
And process.
So let's talk a little bit about process then. So
Yes.
The last campaign ended in 2014.
Right.
What are your plans for the next campaign?
I'd say very soon, Pete. We're in sort of the very quiet phase. I hope to soon be in a noisy, quiet phase. COVID delayed us probably about 12 to 18 months, because what it did was it delayed the updated plan for Pitt. So that is pretty much near a completion. I think it will be formally completed in September. And it's given us just a real framework. It doesn't really change sort of the fundamentals of faculty and student support and campus investments and big initiatives, but it does provide the rubric to talk about it. So everything we're doing is about campaign and capacity building. So more on that very soon.
No, very soon. Okay. Well, so I was talking to another vice president not all that long ago, and they said something really interesting to me. I wanted to get your thoughts on it. They said that we operate at the nexus of institutional vision, brand, and resources. So can you describe what that means to you?
Yeah, I think your colleague's pretty bright. It's interesting. The vision thing is not always something we can make happen. I think we can refine it, but I think that's part of where you choose to work, right? Are you working for somebody who does have a vision and that can be communicated? And our brand, I think for Pitt during COVID, I think our brand sustained us, particularly on the vaccine and what our vaccine center was doing and our support for students. So yeah, I think we have to stick that landing every single time, right? To make sure we're really clear on what our brand is. And for resources, despite talking a lot about process, I do get back to people, right? I just think, you know, we want the most creative, the most thoughtful, the most committed. And my job is to make them feel really empowered, right? So we get those big ideas. Folks who work with me are going to be tired of this, but I love to quote Aaron Sorkin in the show Sports Night, where the producer had said, if you're dumb, surround yourself with smart people. And if you're smart, surround yourself with smart people who argue with you. And I think that's true. So when I think of resources, I think like, do I have the right organization? Am I bringing the right caliber of talent to really execute well? Because there's not a lot of room for mistakes. You know, so certainly programmatic funds, investment, we're going through a conversion, all of that stuff is critical, but none of it works if I don't have the right people. So that's where I get my brain goes to when I talk about resources.
And I think, you know, as we think about scaling our efforts or building a strong culture of philanthropy, those resources are your team, but also these other resources that are going to help to make this campaign successful. So how do you bring, I mean, partly it goes to where you are now in the campaign and developing vision and you know, ultimately translating that into the philanthropic objectives. But how are you bringing along this entire community in this process, so that by the time you get to the noisy quiet phase, which is fascinating me, that you kind of have everybody on the same page?
When you say the community, you mean the staff or
your team, deans, volunteers, leadership?
Yeah, I mean, for the philanthropic and alumni engagement team, I think they all know. I mean, God knows we've all sat on enough Zoom town halls this year to communicate, and I do try to distill that. I think within the senior leadership, it's been very clear we're going to be going into a campaign. And so, you know, I am having all those conversations about budget and who's going to do what and travel and all those kinds of things. I don't really worry about readying this community for a campaign. What I focus on is readying them for this campaign. So the last campaign had volunteer leadership, but we didn't ask as much of them as I will be asking, right? The last campaign had analytics, but we're going to have more robust analytics. The last campaign, I think, well, I can't speak to that, but I think we are going to be much more proactive with what we're asking for. Now, obviously, if somebody wants to make a gift, our answer is thank you. But a lot of what we've seen is that when, I mean, this is not surprising, when we can put a compelling vision in front of somebody rather than just sort of letting them tell us what they might be interested in, we actually get a bigger gift, but we also have a better relationship. So I think what I'm kind of focused on is how do I message what this campaign is? The last campaign was very successful. It set a high water mark for Pitt, but it was, you know, by the time we go live, it'll be 10 years ago, and 10 years in this world is like forever. So it will be, again, a lot of these conversations and a lot of tapping into people like my board chair and other folks who are great ambassadors and great advocates. And certainly my colleagues who do the best talking about what we do and how we do it and why we do it.
So here we are envisioning the next several years ahead. With the Delta variant, though, raising its head, can I end on a question of just how is that thrown a wrench in your plans for coming back, or?
Well, we are sort of turning the dial on physically returning to the workplace after Labor Day. I think, like a lot of other places, we've instituted remote and flexible work arrangements. But, you know, the changes, it used to be about public health and safety, and now it's about performance and employee satisfaction and employer retention. So we're working through all of how what that means. And on campus, Pitt is coming back, and in fact, a number of people have been back in the office since mid-July. You know, it's interesting, though. I think that the main takeaway for me is that while it completely upended everything, you know, and I can stress a little bit about our pipeline for this year and other things, I think if what we do is remind ourselves that upending actually turned into some really great things for our work, again, and how we do it, how we learn to use technology. I mean, we had our best Pitt Day of Giving ever, and nobody was on campus. You know, so what did we learn from that? And what can we remember, and can we be, you know, pretty jazzed up about that? So, you know, I kind of get back to like, what are our objectives? What are we trying to do? And yes, maybe now we all have to do it in a different way, but like, that's okay. Like, new is good sometimes. So you know, we don't have any choice, right? Like sort of deciding things had to be the way they were, like, that's just not the world we live in. So we're just going to be foolishly optimistic.
Oh, that's the space you want to be in.
Exactly.
And Chris, thank you so much for sharing all the great things
Yeah.
that are going on. And this has been extremely valuable. And thanks to everyone else for joining us today. We're all learning from each other during this remarkable time.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
If there are some questions out there, please don't hesitate to let us know. I know Chris has made herself available to answer any of them. And we'd love to stay in contact with all of you. So hope you all have a great rest of your week. And again, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me. Bye.